My name's David Hennessy, and in this video I'll be discussing the confessional poetry of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes in the context of Diane Middlebrook's essay, The Poetry of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, : Response. I'll profile Middlebrook's key argument, which is that the output of these two poets hinges on what she calls a dynamic of mutual influence that produced the poems we read today. In the process, I'll be focusing specifically on two texts: Plath's Ariel, the Restored Edition, and Hughes's Birthday Letters. Let's start with some background on Plath and Hughes. In brief, the two poets met at university, married just 4 months later, had 2 children, and separated after Hughes began an affair. The year after their separation, Plath committed suicide. Her last manuscript, Ariel, was first published 2 years after her death. However, partly in response to personal content described by Plath and Hughes' daughter as lacerating, Hughes flexed his authority as executor of the Plath estate and substituted a large number of the poems in Plath's manuscript with some of her other uncollected work. It wasn't until 2004 that Plath's manuscript was published in its original form as Ariel, the Restored Edition. Ted Hughes began writing poems that would eventually appear in Birthday Letters over a period of more than 25 years following Plath's suicide, and all but 2 of the poems are addressed to Plath. Published just before Hughes' death in 1998, Birthday Letters could be viewed as a rebuttal to Plath's Ariel poems, but as Middlebrook's essay points out, the intertextuality at play in these poems is more complicated than that. Middlebrook charts the development of the entwined literary career of Plath and Hughes, addressing 3 distinct phases: courtship, marriage, and separation. She traces the poetic call and response between Plath and Hughes all the way back to their first encounter, claiming that Plath's first words to Hughes were, "I did it, I," a line from his poem Law in the Country of the Cats. Middlebrook describes the courtship phase as marked by Plath's admiration of Hughes as superior author. In response to the violence and passion of their meeting, and to Hughes's poetic depictions of human passion as animal violence, Plath wrote her poem Pursuit, portraying Hughes as a predatory panther. Hughes's rebuttal in Birthday Letters is twofold. Firstly, his poem St. Botolph's repaints that first encounter in nostalgia and the tragedy of fate. Then Trophies returns to the violence of Plath's panther metaphor, recasting Plath and her father complex as the predatory figure. Pursuit opens, "There is a panther stalks me down, one day I'll have my death of him." While Trophies counters, "The panther? It had already dragged you, as if in its jaws across Europe." Trophies further responds to the account of the first Plath-Hughes encounter preserved in Plath's journal, where Plath focuses on earrings and a headband Hughes took from her. Hughes uses this image to position Plath as the panther, stating, "As it carried me off, I detached the hairband carefully from between its teeth, and a ring from its ear for my trophies." Middlebrook delineates the increasingly explicit creative interplay between Plath and Hughes's poetry in the early years of their married life. She provides the background for poems which would eventually be published in Ariel. These include Your and Morning Song. Middlebrook describes Plath's poem Your, written during her first pregnancy, as an initiating call whose animal imagery Hughes responded to in his own poem Lines for a Newborn Baby. Hughes composed his response on the back of one of Plath's typescripts, marking the beginning of what would become common practice for both authors, based, according to Middlebrook, on a kind of magical thinking in which both of them indulged. Plath herself then took cues from lines in the construction of her poem Morning Song, revising Hughes's line, "Some cloud touching a pond with reflection," in the post-birth darkness of "I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand." This dark and bitter tone is characteristic of Plath's Ariel voice, which became further defined as her marriage to Hughes dissolved. Middlebrook notes that as this final phase of the Plath-Hughes relationship dawned, Plath began infusing imagery from Hughes's unfinished play The Calm into some of her most lacerating Ariel poems, including Daddy, A Secret, and Lesbos. Hughes's rebuttals to the Ariel poems are dense, intricate, and at times very direct. In The Jailer, Plath depicts her husband as brutal and controlling. Hughes fires back in The Blackbird, informing Plath, "You were the jailer of your murderer." His response to Plath's The Rabbit Catcher is subtly titled The Rabbit Catcher, and begins by depicting a domestic dispute between Plath and himself, which he portrays as a mysterious, half-forgotten accident. Hughes's The Rabbit Catcher uses the image of a Dybbuk, a possessive spirit, as well as words like crazy and simmering, to present Plath as altogether unstable. Plath presents the rabbit catcher as a torturous device used to strangle innocents, a metaphor for her bond to Hughes. Hughes counters this with his image of a rabbit snare, a mere cultural tool used by simple people to ease their poverty and appetites. In doing so, Hughes undermines Plath's perspective on the dynamic of their relationship, effectively accusing her of being hypersensitive and relocating their marital problems to cultural territory and to Plath's own psychological instability. These are just some examples of the call and response dynamic that saturates both Ariel and Birthday Letters. This intertextual dialogue leads Middlebrook to conclude that in many of the works that flowed from that heavenly creative partnership, they are indissoluble.